Kia ora, Māori ora ki te whare, ngā mihi mahana ki o koutou katoa. Tēnei te mihi atu ki te mana whenua o te rohi nei, nā i tua huriri, nau mai, haere mai ki te whare wānanga o Waitaha, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Kuia, Ngāti Kuata, Rangitānei o Wairau, Ngāti Apa ki te Rātō, Madi Williams tōku ingoa. So kia ora koutou, welcome to the University of Canterbury's Tauhere UC Connect lecture series. I'm Madi Williams, I'm a lecturer here in Aotearoa, the School of Māori and Indigenous Studies. Thank you so much for coming out on such a horribly stormy, cold evening. We really appreciate it. So these lectures are free. Thank you for registering to attend already. If you haven't already done so, you can also sign up to be alerted to the rest of the public lectures that are coming up. If you want to get first access to attend these lectures, please sign up for the UC Connect mailing list. Using the tablet by the door on the way out, or the UC hosts that you'll see in the t-shirts will be able to help you as well. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope you enjoy this evening. And so just before we kind of get into the lecture content, I just need to do the kind of housekeeping, health and safety things that we're all used to by now. So firstly, just ensure please that your phones are on silent. Wharipaku are just outside on either side of this lecture theatre. If you hear the fire alarm, just follow UC staff instructions, mainly the UC hosts in the t-shirt in that instance, and follow them to the evacuation points and remain as a group. In the very unlikely event, hopefully, of an earthquake, please just stay seated and take shelter and don't evacuate until the UC staff indicate to do so. Should it be necessary, which hopefully it will not be, once you exit the Central Lecture Theatre, there's the gathering point by the Geography Building, but people would direct you where to go for that. So moving on from that, so the format tonight is like a 45 minute lecture, and then we'll have 10 or so minutes for some questions and answers after that. So if there's anything you would like to ask, we'll have heaps of time at the end to do that, and then hopefully we'll finish up at about 8 p.m. So right, let's get into the content. So tonight we're going to explore how we frame and how we look at the histories of Aotearoa New Zealand. This talk is somewhat based on the book that I published last year, Polynesian 900 to 1600, an overview of the history of Aotearoa Rēkohu and Rapa Nui. So the book looks at the history of South Polynesia during the European Middle Ages. And it was intended to provide like a short, useful overview of the history of South Polynesia. And so in it, it uses a wide range of source material, historical literature, archaeology, oral histories, and aims to give a South Polynesian perspective of the world between 900 and 1600. So the talk tonight is somewhat based on the book, but it takes it in kind of a different direction that wasn't covered within the book. So we're going to look at these topics tonight, but in the wider frame of how we think about New Zealand history and how we engage with it as well. So for some initial context or background about the topic, so Aotearoa New Zealand was the last significant landmass to be inhabited by humans when voyagers arrived from Polynesia in the 13th century. So the dates for the initial migrations have undergone some changes as scholarship has developed over the years, but it's now generally accepted that voyagers were arriving here in the 12th and 13th centuries. And so following their arrival, these voyagers adapted and innovated at an astounding rate to their new environments, and this then informed the development of a Māori culture here. So the first European arrival to our shores was not until 1642 with the arrival of Abel Tasman, but he actually never stepped ashore himself. So as noted by Māori scholar Nēpia Mahuika, New Zealand history is Māori history first and foremost. Despite this, the histories of New Zealand are often examined in connection to Britain and discussed in terms of colonisation. So although an important feature of our colonial history, focusing on this alone neglects the wealth of other connections and histories and serves to erase the vast and broad range of histories of Māori and our links back to Polynesia as well. And so the histories of Aotearoa are more accurately situated in this Polynesian context. And so what I propose is that we reframe the way that we look at the past in New Zealand. So rather than just looking at it as this kind of better Britain and an offshoot of Europe, we centre Polynesia and the Pacific in our longer history. This is certainly topical at the moment in the past couple of weeks with the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, as we look to our future but also re-evaluate our past. So we obviously cannot ignore the impact that colonisation has had on our history, but by examining the period following Polynesian arrival to these shores, we can illuminate a richer history of these islands. And it's also important for us to remember that Europe is not the natural centre of the world. It has been constructed as such, not least by historians, and there is much to learn if we reorient ourselves from different perspectives. So in this recent updated work by John H. Arnold, he asked, what is medieval history? And he described the point of global history more broadly has been to challenge grand narratives that unthinkingly place Europe at their centre and as their default point of reference. So for instance, on this map by fellow UC scholar David Garcia, he has re-centred Polynesia, and by viewing the world in this way, Europe has been de-centred and it changes our perspective completely. So we often kind of unquestioningly accept Europe as the centre of the world or as our point of reference, but it's important for us to remember that this is a construct. And so to this end, with that kind of framing around it, tonight I'm going to go through some key points that hopefully by the end of it will sound connected. So how we think about New Zealand history now and some of our main narratives around it. I'll discuss some of the pūrākau, or the stories that highlight our connections to Polynesia, such as Maui. I'll briefly talk about some place names and some language similarities between the regions. And then we'll take a look at the histories of these islands before the arrival of Europeans. So for those of you that are familiar with the book, that's kind of where more of the book content will be coming in. We'll look at what happened after their arrival. And then finally, briefly at the end, I'll touch on some further kind of reframing context for how we look at the past here. So I'm sure we've all heard the idea that New Zealand doesn't really have a history. It's so short, we don't have the ruins, the castles, the churches that are thousands of years old. And a lot of people remain unconvinced that New Zealand has a rich history, and instead they often think that history is something that happened in Europe, in the Mediterranean, and in Britain, particularly for us. So our history here in New Zealand is generally framed as beginning in 1840 with the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. Anything occurring before this is seen as sort of a backstory to the story of the nation, a prehistory. And so as you will hopefully come to see tonight, this doesn't have to be the case, but it certainly is if we only view our history from 1840 onwards. And so the list that you can see on the slide there, this is from a 2005 study. It was done with university undergraduate students, asking them to rate the 10 most important events in New Zealand history. So for Pākehā students, they listed the Treaty of Waitangi, European arrival, land wars, women's suffrage, the World Wars, Māori arrival, European settlement, the Springbok tour, and then the Great Depression. So as you'll be able to tell, only one of these, Māori arrival, occurred before European settlement of New Zealand. Across the different study groups that they did, the Treaty of Waitangi was consistently regarded as the foundational event of our history, and it's often regarded as this kind of key starting point for us. So New Zealand history then is seen as beginning with colonisation, with the key event being the signing of the treaty. Anything occurring before colonisation is viewed as a sort of myth or prehistory, and it's then relegated to a status of less importance. And so the idea that history began with the arrival of Europeans is an incredibly problematic one, as it implies that Māori were only brought into history through contact with Europeans. And so one of our earliest historical myths that we have here, and that has dominated, is the idea that New Zealand is a haven of peaceful race relations and harmony, and the signing of the treaty then became kind of a key symbol for this myth. It was emphasised by William Hobson's infamous phrase, he iwi tahi tātou, which has been translated as we are one people. It's debated whether or not this was even said, and the translation has certainly been debated as well. But nevertheless, it's been held up as a symbol of our racial harmony. And so the status of the signing of the treaty as symbolic of peaceful race relations rests on the paternalistic assumption that the treaty was a privilege for Māori, regardless of the translation issues and the abuses that then occurred. So to negate the uncomfortable issues around the abuses, the study of the treaty has generally been confined to the signing of the treaty rather than its effects and impacts. It's felt that Māori should feel grateful for the treaty and for the benefits it has bestowed upon us. It could have been worse, they say. This kind of relativist approach to injustice is an unhelpful one, and it does nothing to set things to right. However, it did serve the purpose of helping to forge our national identity, and it was used to try to convince Māori that we're better off than other Indigenous groups. The image of New Zealand as a haven of peaceful race relations has been purposefully promoted to help differentiate us from other nations on the international stage. This fits nicely with our other key national narrative that we're a clean, green nation. These ideas about harmony between races have permeated our society to the point that a significant number of New Zealanders are not aware of the full history, the good and the bad, because it has been so sanitised and edited. This has led people to think that the colonisation of New Zealand was a relatively peaceful and harmonious affair. So as we all know, discourse surrounding the past in Aotearoa can be pretty contentious, and this is partly due to the role that history plays in our identity. There's a prevailing one people narrative on a national level that we'll see increasingly coming up to the election being wheeled out, which the past has been shaped to fit. We're all just New Zealanders now, regardless of where we've come from in the past. History in New Zealand has promoted this narrative above all others. Aspects of the past are then glorified and mythologised as representing our national identity, while simultaneously we have a widespread historical amnesia about any kind of unpalatable aspects of our past. This current approach of promoting aspects of our past since 1840 has then sought to erode any other perspectives and experiences. So Māori, iwi and hapu perspectives have often been ignored in these national historical narratives. However, I should note that these perspectives have been retained in the communities from which they originate. There have also been attempts to redress this imbalance in the historical narratives, and these other perspectives have been increasingly written into the histories. So one example is the work of Nēpia Mahuika, who I mentioned earlier. So his 2009 article, Revitalising Te Ika o Māui, sought to problematise the nation as a site of power imbalance, where Māori histories tend to be reduced to myths and prehistory as decoration to the central story. The current approach to history in New Zealand has contributed to the destruction of identities. It's widely acknowledged that it plays a vital role in forming our group identities. It acts as a form of social glue to bind us together. And this has often been used against Māori groups for the benefit of the national narrative. So as put by historian Margaret Macmillan, history provides much of the fuel for nationalism. It creates collective memories that help bring the nation into being. The shared celebration of the nation's greatest achievements and the shared sorrow at its defeats sustain and foster it. And so this is precisely what has occurred in Aotearoa, where aspects of the past are prioritised and elevated and then seen to represent the entirety of our history. These aspects have become seen as defining moments of the nation and have subsequently been elevated to the status of myth. So the World Wars, Gallipoli, the Treaty of Waitangi and the Springbok Tour are kind of the key things that we tend to discuss when we think about our history. And so when I'm using the word myth here, it aligns with the definition used by James Belich. So myth is an idea which persists for reasons other than its truth because it performs an important social and cultural function. So it's that acting as a form of social glue for the nation's identity. So for example of how this has happened, in the late 19th century, there was a really strong desire to retain Māori history and traditions, as it was popularly believed that Māori were a dying race. So this led to the founding of the Polynesian Society in 1892. And so one of the most important ideas to emerge from this period was the Great Fleet myth that some of you may be familiar with already. And so the Great Fleet myth saw Māori history being subsumed into a European template of exploration and settlement. This myth was created by members of the Polynesian Society in the early 20th century. And so the narrative went that Kupe arrived in an uninhabited Aotearoa. He was followed by Toi and Whātonga, who arrived and found a primitive and nomadic Moriori, And then in 1350, a great fleet of 7 canoes arrived from Tahiti, and they then killed the inferior Moriori. So this is an oversimplified and very inaccurate narrative, and these types of early works often promoted the narrative that there was this kind of pre-contact Māori past that could be summed up with the Great Fleet myth, and then this then culminated in conversion to Christianity and the signing of the treaty, and then New Zealand was born, and we just move on from there. So what happened afterwards is often marginalised or ignored, and the negative aspects are conveniently just skimmed over. So with that framing in place, now we're going to take a look at the history of these islands with a further view than just 1840 onwards. So we're all likely somewhat familiar with the stories of Maui, the trickster hero of Polynesian mythology. So Maui, for Māori in our Māori traditions, is said to have hauled Te Ika a Maui, the North Island, or the fish of Maui, from the ocean with the jawbone of his grandmother, Muriranga Whenua. He's also attributed with slowing the sun, creating more daylight, and in his search for immortality, he is crushed by Hinenui Te Pō as he tries to reverse the birth process. So these traditions have typically been viewed as a mythical backstory to the nation's history, but rather than viewing it as just a backstory, we can take the traditions of Maui and instead see them as illustrating our connections to our Polynesian origins. So the traditions of Maui and his equivalents can be found across the Pacific. The name Maui or its variants are very widespread, and the stories all follow similar patterns. So in Yap, Maui's equivalent is said to have fished up the land, just as Maui fished up Te Ika a Maui. Similarly, in Tonga, Maui Atalanga is said to have fished up islands. He's also said to have fished up the Tuamotu Islands. And Maui's exploits always involve adventure, risk, and trying to achieve the impossible using his resourcefulness. And so traditions such as those of Maui, they provide us with our instructions for life and our behaviour, our morals, and our values. And so we can take this a step further as well. So by looking at traditions such as these, we can also see synergies and parallels with the European world, which we first came into contact with Abel Tasman in 1642. So there are some really interesting similarities to be found in comparative mythologies. The work of Joseph Campbell is particularly useful here. His book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, discusses Maui. So he proposed that in order to comprehend the meaning of myths fully, we need to compare a range of them from around the world. So take, for example, the hero myth, the archetypes of which can be seen throughout the world. So you have the hero, who is generally the founder of a new system of belief or location. The heroes must go off in search of the new and often begin with their exile as an infant and then their subsequent return to their communities when they're older. So for example, for Maui, he is miscarried as a fetus and then placed in the ocean, but later he returns to his family. A common event within these myths is also when the hero attempts and fails rebirth. So such is the case of Maui when he attempts to conquer death by reversing the birth process. He transforms into a lizard and enters Hinenui Te Pō, also known as Hinetitama, goddess of the underworld, but he fails at that mission and is crushed. So similar examples of this trope abound. So for instance, Heracles in Greek myth, when he cuts himself out of the monster sent by Poseidon, and in the Old Testament myth of Jonah and the whale. So these myths are all exploring the theme of mortality by portraying its inevitability to us, and it explains its presence in the world, but in a way that shows us that death is necessary to transcend earthly limits. So it's symbolic of a fall into the dark or the unknown. So other pūrākau or stories that we brought with us also highlight our connections to Polynesia. So in Tasman Bay, for example, there is a taniwha known as Te Kaiwhakaruaki, and he takes the form of a nārara or a lizard and lives in a stream at Parapada, Aorere, which is Golden Bay. So it's said that Te Kaiwhakaruaki would attack those travelling between Tākaka and Motueka. And in one version of the pūrākau, Kaiwhakaruaki was killed by Te Koheta, who was visiting from Arahura on the west coast. So to get the attention of the taniwha, kokowai, which is red ochre, which is an important resource that is found at Parapara, was thrown into the stream. And so the picture on the slide, you can see Parapara up towards the top, and then Tākaka down here, and Motueka is just a bit further round to the east as well. And so in Tahiti, there is also a similar narrative of a taniwha named Aotearoa. This taniwha would attack those travelling between Tāhaha and Motueka, and it was eventually killed by a person from Araura. So this pūrākau was very clearly brought with the ancestors from the homeland Hawaii, and was then adapted and applied to their new environments as they travelled. These pūrākau also contain really important information about the location of precious resources such as the kokowai, the red ochre and Parapara, and help us to remember where those resources can be found. And the killing of taniwha is also important in pūrākau. It symbolises the claiming of mana over land and resources. And so this is just one example, and there are many more of our examples and connections with the stories of the Pacific. So just as the place names Tākaka and Motueka were brought from the homeland, many other names were brought with the ancestors and placed on these new locations. So for example, Aoraki, or known as Mount Cook, the highest mountain in Te Waipounamu, the South Island, is also a name that was brought from Hawaii. So the highest peak in Tahiti is known as Aorai, and opposite Aorai is the mountain Heurai. These names were also taken to Rarotonga and applied to the environment there, slightly adapted to Ikurangi and Arorangi. So Hikurangi or Hikuraki, depending on the dialect, is a common name across both Te Ika a Maui and Te Waipounamu. So there are 40 mountains known as Hikurangi in Te Ika Maui, the North Island, some of which are depicted on the map, but not all of them. These often occur nearby to an auraki or aorangi, and are generally symbols of guardianship and mana. So the name also occurs in Te Waipounamu, the South Island. There is a bay known as Hikuraki Bay, which is a little bit hard to see on this map, but it's in here. And so that's located in Banks Peninsula, just south of Te Wairewa or Lake Forsyth. There's also a Ngāti Kuia Pā site in the Marlborough Sounds known as Hikuraki. So our tribal traditions tell of our ancestor Koanga Umu, who was engaged in fighting the Ngāti Tūmata Kōkiri in the Marlborough Sounds. When he was taken prisoner during the battle, he built a raft with what he could find. He recited karakia, or prayers and incantations, as he set out to escape. And so as he was escaping, he called on our taniwha Kai Awaro to help him to safety. And the location where he eventually reaches safety is Hikurangi or Hikuraki in Ngāti Kuia and Ngaitahu dialects, which is also located in Forsyth Bay in the Sounds. So Tā Tipene O'Regan explained the process of naming that was undertaken. He said that each time we voyaged onwards, we rolled up our legends, our whakapapa and our place names, and carried them with us to be unrolled in a new place and fitted to a new landscape. And so these names provide us with an oral map of our environment, and they provide us with our links and connections back to Polynesia. These names, of course, were often covered over with English names, and traditions and place names contain vital information. They retain and illuminate our connections to Polynesia, and they also tell of our origins and our beliefs. So just before we kind of get a bit more into the history of these islands once Polynesian voyagers arrived, I'm just going to give a bit of context on what we see and discuss as Polynesia. So the map on the slide there is just of the various migrations that were taken across Polynesia and the kind of centuries they occurred in. So Polynesia, as we typically understand it, is divided into three general regions. So you've got west, east and south. Western Polynesia consists of Tonga, Samoa, Futuna and Uvia or Wallis, and was the first part of Polynesia to be inhabited. Eastern Polynesia was next up to be inhabited, so that's where you have Hawaii, Tahiti, the Marquesas Islands, the Cook Islands, the Austral Islands, the Tuamotus, and Rapa Nui or Easter Island. And then South Polynesia was lucky last to be inhabited, made up of Aotearoa, obviously, Rikohu, the Chatham Islands, and the Auckland Islands as well. So Polynesia is itself a Western label and artificial construct. The term Polynesia is derived from the Greek words poly, which means many, and nesia, which means island. Polynesia is used to identify the region in the Polynesian Triangle. So that's where the points are made up of Rapa Nui off the coast of Chile, so Easter Island, Hawaii, and Aotearoa New Zealand, and our outlier islands as well. So the Pacific was divided into Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia by a French navigator, Jules Sebastien Dumont d'Urville, in the 19th century. That's also where Rangitoto d'Urville Island gets its English name from. So the terms near and remote Oceania are also used by some, but Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia have tended to be used more commonly. So when Europeans first encountered Polynesian societies, a really frequent observation that they made was that the languages seemed to be remarkably similar between the locations. They initially thought it was just one single language, which they soon discovered was not correct. However, the languages do belong to the same language family. So the overall group is known as the Austronesian language family, and the Polynesian groups are part of a subgroup known as Oceanic. And the languages of Polynesia do have some striking similarities. So a recent study has found that the Moriori and Māori languages are about 70% similar, and the Moriori and Rapa Nui languages have about 22% similarity. And this is really remarkable given the distance between these locations, particularly the latter two. There are many examples of the similarities in the languages. So for example, the word for mountain is maunga in both Moriori and Māori, and maunga in Rapa Nui. And similarly, the word for sacred in all three languages is tapu. And so although there are all these similarities, the importance of differences should also not be underestimated. So there's a tendency to kind of homogenise Polynesian people, and then that kind of removes all the uniqueness as well from their histories. So for instance, while the east and west of Polynesia have tropical climates, South Polynesia, as we're experiencing today, does not. It's a very temperate, temperamental climate, and so its climate was then a defining factor because the arrivals from tropical Polynesia had to really adapt at a quick rate to be able to survive in this new climate. And so this then, their high degree of innovation, then influenced the development of unique economies in different parts of the country. So while in some ways very culturally similar, different areas did develop in very different ways. So as the Polynesian voyagers dispersed and migrated, as you can see in the map there, over the course of centuries, distinct identities and cultures emerged, including obviously for our purposes tonight, Māori, and so that's what we're going to dive into in a bit more detail now. So the view that New Zealand doesn't have a deep, rich history is simply nonsensical if we reframe it and place it in its Polynesian context. So we have a deep and rich history spanning thousands of years, shared with our whanaunga, our relations, our kin across the Pacific. And so we're now going to explore the arrival of these Polynesian voyagers in Aotearoa and what happened after they arrived. So when they first arrived in Aotearoa, it was basically covered in forest, and offered a seemingly limitless array of resources. So it was abundant with flightless birds that were unused to having any human predators, and the landscape provided pretty much endless opportunities for these new arrivals. There was a subsequent decline in resources, including some deforestation, extinction of species, such as the flightless moa in the 14th and 15th centuries. And although practiced from initial settlement, horticulture did become increasingly important over time. So more intensive methods of horticulture required us to have more stationary lifestyles and safe storage for the crops. And so by the 14th and 15th centuries, Māori society had become more settled. Although there were still high levels of mobility, there were more stationary locations as well. And so as they became more stationary and resource ability declined somewhat, a distinctly Māori culture was developing, defined and shaped by the environment of Aotearoa, with influences from and connections to our Polynesian homelands. So the themes that emerge in this era, and these are the themes that shape the book's chapters, are origins and migration, adaptation to new environments, and then the cultural development that occurred. So the arrival of voyagers in Aotearoa is a testament to their voyaging and navigational skills. Although these were often disparaged in early histories, it is clear that these skills were unrivaled elsewhere. So the voyagers who arrived in Aotearoa were primarily from East Polynesia, with room for the possibility of other Polynesian locations being a point of departure. And prior to East Polynesia, there were connections and links back to West Polynesia and Southeast Asia. So Polynesian narratives of migration give accounts of departure from the homeland, from Hawaii. Rather than referring to a single location, Hawaii means homeland and can be applied to multiple locations as they travelled. A common tradition across many but not all tribes are the kupe traditions, so one of the first arrivals in Aotearoa. There are variations in these traditions as to why he left Hawaii, and these traditions help tell us about the motivations for the voyagers and migrators that came from Polynesia. So reasons given for kupe's travels included marital strife, conflict in the homeland, the desire for more power, resource scarcity, a sense of adventure, and in many versions he then returns home and gives instructions and guidelines for the migrations for others to follow. The migration traditions have been subject to a lot of misinterpretation. There were some attempts to date them using Western concepts of time being applied to whakapapa or genealogy manuscripts, and these resulted in just misunderstandings of the tradition and were then used to create things such as the Great Fleet myth. Other traditions were interpreted very literally, when clearly from a Māori perspective they were using symbolism to portray meaning and retain critical information that we needed. They are also unique to the tribes that they emerge from. So although they'll have common themes, they'll follow some common narrative templates, there are variations, and the traditions were adapted to the different environment of each tribe as well. So Polynesians are renowned for their navigation and voyaging skills. Their navigation to South Polynesia was an impressive technological achievement. It was unrivaled by their contemporaries anywhere else in the world. These have been described as among the greatest acts of voyage and discovery in world history and have been compared to modern space travel. The traditional accounts of migration are really well preserved, but these accounts were repeatedly misinterpreted and misunderstood by early scholars. The voyages have often been debated. It was previously argued that the Polynesians merely drifted to the south. It was called the drift voyage theory, and they ended up doing all these kind of computer tests and things to disprove that theory, but it was a very prominent one and still is in some people's minds, with early scholars unable to appreciate the voyaging ability of the Polynesians. However, it is now largely accepted, except maybe a determined few, that Polynesians deliberately came to South Polynesia and their navigation skills are proven and recognised. The achievement and skill of these early voyages really can't be overemphasised. Reaching Aotearoa was an exceptional accomplishment for these early navigators, particularly when one compares it to what was occurring in the rest of the world during this time. So as scholar Jeff Evans has written, when most European seamen were still hugging the shoreline as they sailed from port to port along their coastlines, the Polynesians had already sailed halfway across the vast Pacific Ocean on voyages of discovery. So some early scholars, I should note, did recognise the achievement of these early voyages, so such as Percy Smith, or Stevenson Percy Smith. He wrote in 1904, "Who after this will deny to the Polynesians the honour that is their due as skilful and daring navigators? Long before our ancestors had learnt to venture out of sight of land, these bold sailors had explored the Antarctic seas and traversed the Pacific Ocean from end to end." Despite this, many scholars continued to discount the achievements of these early navigators, claiming that their journeys must have had to be accidental. So when they first landed here in Aotearoa, they had to rethink everything that they knew about horticulture, about subsistence or food gathering practices. So the lands, as I've mentioned here, were temperate compared to their tropical homelands. Furthermore, as we know, Aotearoa does have significant regional variation in climate, with the North Island being much warmer and more conducive to horticulture than the south. So the voyagers had brought with them kumara, sweet potato, taro, yam, gourd and paper mulberry in terms of crops. In terms of animals, only the kuti, the Pacific dog, and the kiori, the rat, survived, but there were likely more animals brought on the voyages that didn't make it much further. So there was a range of subsistence practices, so this included hunting and gathering, fishing and horticulture. Obviously it was filled with birds that weren't used to having any predators. So these became a critical food source in some areas, but fishing was really the dominant subsistence. Is it good now? Oh. A critical food source in some areas. Yeah, we're better now. Okay, cool. Thank you. But it soon became clear to these new arrivals that these resources weren't as limitless as they had first appeared when they had arrived. So there was a shift to more reliance on horticultural practices. So although it was practiced from initial arrival, it took on a higher importance following the resource reduction of the other resources. So for instance, the moa was extinct by 1450, and although the moa's importance has been overstated in terms of how important it was in subsistence practices, it did lead to a reliance on more fishing in those areas where moa had been important. So the main point to note here is that the environment, whatever it was, drove life and adaptation in Aotearoa. These arrivals had to adapt what they knew to survive in these lands. The navigation knowledge and skills required to reach Aotearoa was really helpful in this sense. So such as knowledge of the stars, the moon and the weather, this was quickly adapted to be applied to horticulture just as it was to their voyaging. So they adapted the horticultural practices, most notably the kumara was adapted to an annual cycle rather than a shorter one, but the kumara also got a lot harder to grow the further south you went, and therefore southern areas naturally relied more on hunting, gathering and a lot of fishing. So this is evidenced through archaeological studies of sites, so such as the Pūrākau Nui settlement site in the South Island. So archaeological studies there have shown that 90% of the food there was fish, so a very heavy reliance on it in those areas. Adaptation and change are really key themes in our early history here. It's defined by its short time frame and significant amount of change within that short time frame. Aotearoa was empty of human habitation, that's an important point that we need to keep correcting the myths on, and required innovative approaches in order for these new inhabitants to survive. A limited number of traditions relating to this era of our history still exist, but they're a lot more limited than the traditions of our voyages. And so part of the reason for this is due to one of the purposes of oral tradition, which was to recount and retain information necessary to explain the present and how we came to be here and retain important information that we needed. It wasn't as important to us to retain information about day-to-day activities. And so that's where archaeology has come in quite helpful, because often that evidence tells us those kind of day-to-day details. The adaptation that they went through wasn't a quick process. Full understanding wouldn't have occurred for generations. When they first arrived, they must have been impressed with this huge wealth of resources on offer. Would have been particularly true for arrivals in Aotearoa just because of our sheer size here. The environment was extremely rich in these resources. So over time, there was a reasonably fast reduction in some of these resources. This was a pattern that was common throughout Polynesia, but it was exemplified most dramatically here in Aotearoa. It was soon understood that these resources were not limitless, and so efforts were then made to conserve them and to look after the environment. Despite these efforts, the early inhabitants naturally did have a significant impact on these new environments. So following successful adaptation to the new lands they found themselves in, there was obviously a period of population growth, and with an increasing population, there's also a growing strain on resources, and this influenced the development of different group identities. So as society was becoming increasingly settled in the 14th and 15th centuries, there were changes in our dominant social groupings. So the East Polynesian cultures in Aotearoa were becoming notably and distinctly Māori in the 16th century, and there's a list of resources at the end that I'll give you that can discuss that in some more depth as well. The term Māori simply means normal. Tangata Māori is just used like normal people. Society was tribally based. The key groups were whānau, so extended family, and hapu or sub-tribe. On arrival in Aotearoa, though, the main identity group was the migratory waka, the canoe that they came on. And the iwi or tribe didn't become super common or important as an identity group until about the 18th century. However, it needs to be understood that these aren't all mutually exclusive identity groups. They all continue to shape contemporary Māori society as well. So they're all based on whakapapa or genealogy and descent from common ancestors, and these are what bind the group together. These categories are still invoked by Māori when one is introducing themselves and making connections. So people generally give their waka, iwi, hapu and whānau to situate themselves and make links to others. And so as these resources were declining and the population was booming, there was a corresponding increase in conflict in society. This isn't surprising, but it has been significantly overemphasised in the literature on the topic, and it's led to some really inaccurate stereotypes of Māori as a war-focused people. The idea that Māori once were warriors has been more accurately adapted by Māori scholar Moana Jackson to once were gardeners. And so although war was an important feature of society, it wasn't the primary activity, people spending a lot more time with horticulture or gardening than they were engaging in any kind of conflict. But following the reduction in resources, there was an increased need to be able to store and safely defend your food sources. And this led to a really interesting development in terms of settlement and architecture. So this led to the building of pa, or fortified villages. And so the image on the slide is a map of known pa sites. So red are the ones, if you can't see it up there, within the last 600 years, and blue are the ones that are more than 600 years old. So these developed in the first half of the 16th century. They're mainly found in the North Island context. It was more populated. Obviously, its climate better suited to horticulture. There are a really wide variety of pa sites, so they're not all kind of that typical image we would think of a fortified pa. Some were hardly fortified. They were much like a kainga or a village. Others were heavily fortified, and food storage and defence was their primary usage. And so their role could also change over time depending on the needs of the group, so one pa might be used for different things throughout its lifetime. So as the early peoples adapted to their new environments, a series of interesting cultural developments were occurring as well. So in the initial period following arrival, nobody needed to go very far or venture out because the areas were so rich in resources. But as we have that population growth and the resources are coming under strain, groups are dispersing and starting to form new collectives and venturing a bit further. So the material cultures and economies of Polynesia were determined by the land and resources available in each area. So essentially, as the groups adapted to their environments, the cultures changed from East Polynesian to recognisable cultures influenced by the new locations. And so at the same time society was becoming more settled, artistic developments were showing a distinctly Māori element to Polynesian art forms that were brought over in the migrations. So in the 14th and 15th centuries, Māori carving was developing into the recognisably Māori style that we would be familiar with today. It's now generally been accepted that there's always been some form of leadership in Māori society. Leaders were generally, but not exclusively, men, with firstborn males the preference, but while their lineage played a role in their selection, leadership could also be earned, and lineage alone was not enough to secure and hold leadership if the leader was deemed to be unsuitable. So a common theme in traditions is that chiefs were born of a high-ranking line, but that they then achieved their leadership status through their merits and abilities. Leadership was initially the domain of the waka captains from the migrations, and then shifted more to chiefs as social groups changed as well. So upon arrival and through this process of adaptation, as they adapted to new environments, leadership was also adapted alongside it. So in other words, as society split from these canoe groupings into social units, so did the leadership. So the best example of South Island social organisation and material culture is that of Te Pukuhiwi o Kupe, better known today as the Waido Bar. as you can see on the slide. So this is a 14th century site, so pretty early, located in the northeast of the South Island. So this location was a really advantageous one when it was settled. Moor hunting and horticulture were both possible here. It was also close to sources of pakohui or argillite stone, and obviously close to fishing resources as well. So the establishment of more permanent sites enabled further specialisation in material culture to emerge. So there's been a lot of archaeological studies there. So evidence in the excavations found chisels for tattooing, hammerstones, files and abraders for polishing, and these all testify to the role of Waido Bar in early industry here. It's one of our most important archaeological sites and has had numerous studies done on it. So this site provides a significant amount of the information we have currently regarding early settlement in Aotearoa. So it's around 7 hectares in size and contains a whole wealth of insight into early life. So some of the key discoveries include small rectangular houses, several cemeteries and extensive middens, which are basically just rubbish pits. So in addition to this, in the middens pits, what they've found is 39 tonnes of argillite, so pakohui stone, so that was used for adze manufacture and other material goods. 33 tonnes of bone that came from between 4,000 and 12,000 more being butchered at the site. Nearly 2,500 more eggs and over 1,500 tonnes of shell, mostly cockle. So it's particularly useful as a site because it also provides us with evidence of status of wealth, both individual and communal. So one of the key aspects that provides us with this insight are that the burials evidence some form of social hierarchy. So certain individuals would be buried with goods of high value and others would not. So Waido Bar also provides us with a direct link to wider Polynesia. So for instance, the discovery of a chisel from the tropics here has led scholars to think that Waido Bar could be a site of direct settlement from East Polynesia. In 2016, there was also a study done on the remains of an ancestor found at Waido Bar. So one of the ancestors referred to as Auntie, it was discovered was born in Polynesia. Okay. So that was good timing though for a split. Do now, just for the end of the lecture, is to try and bring this back to the idea of reframing our history. So hopefully, as you would have somewhat seen so far, the history of these islands is rich and deep if we take a longer view than 1840 onwards. Our histories are more accurately centred on Polynesia and the Pacific, and this is where the depth can really be found. We are more than our history of colonisation. So some of you may be thinking, but won't we lose our settler colonial history if we reframe on Polynesia? The recentering of our history doesn't mean that we lose anything, but it means that we gain a lot. I'm not seeking to remove any other perspectives from the histories, but merely to include Māori perspectives and fit our histories into the broader template of Polynesian histories. In its current form, New Zealand history has subsumed Māori histories into a European template of colonial history and empire. The histories of these islands is more accurately situated and located in our interconnections with Polynesia and the histories that go back thousands of years. By recentering Polynesia, we can still tell the histories and stories of European arrivals, but they are then included in Māori history of these islands, and Māori history is intricately connected to that of our whanaunga across the Pacific. A really good example of how this has been done in action is the 2019 Tauhere 250 celebrations. So this was a journey of a flotilla of vessels from both Māori and European voyaging traditions across the country. They went to key sites of significance and commemorated the arrival of James Cook to these shores. It was a very different celebration to the 200-year celebration. Māori were not included and the focus was very much on Cook, whereas the 2019 celebration commemorated both Māori and European voyaging and navigation histories. So for Ngāti Kuia, we were involved in the celebrations. Our ancestors had met Cook in the top of the South Island. The image on your right on the slide is from those celebrations in Marlborough. But more importantly for us, when Cook arrived, the ancestors also established a relationship with Tupaia. So Tupaia was a navigator who was on board. He was from Raiatea, and he had joined Cook's voyage in Tahiti. He was absolutely instrumental in the success of the voyage, and he was able to communicate with Māori and translate for the English due to those linguistic similarities that I mentioned earlier. And so the image on the left of the slide is of Joseph Banks. So he was an English botanist and also the namesake of Banks Peninsula. And he in the image is trading crayfish for tapa cloth. And this image was drawn by Tupaia when he was on the ship. So the arrival of Cook for us then was also a reuniting with our kin from Polynesia and the establishment of new relationships with the European arrivals. When our ancestors heard of the death of Tupaia, they composed a lament for him that is still held in our tribal manuscripts. And the Tauhere 250 celebrations were a really good example of these relationships and celebrating them all centred on our joined voyaging pasts. So these interwoven histories of voyaging to these islands are a place where we can converge and reframe how we think about the nation's history. We need to reframe our history from simply thinking about it as a history of a British colony on the other side of the world. New Zealand history is Māori history, and it is richer and deeper than 1840 onwards. We were, in our voyages, gardeners and innovators, with strong links to Polynesia. That should be our focus. Kia mau ki te aka mātua, kei mau ki te aka taipa. So for those wanting to find out more about the topic, the book has a larger bibliography, but this is just some of the key resources that would be a good starting place, and some of those are available online as well. So I'd encourage you to check those out if you're interested. Tangata Whenua and Whakamona are massive coffee table books that are well worth the investment as well. And so, checking my time, we have some time for questions and answers. Please try and keep your question as more of a question than a comment, so we can hopefully get through a few and everyone can get home before the snowstorm kicks in. And the UC host will come around with microphones, so if you have a question, just pop your hand up and they will come to you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, earlier you mentioned a relativist way of thinking. So, do you think it's a good way of thinking, or it's kind of toxic? Because we all want to be show our inclusiveness to other people's perspective, with regard to value, or with regard to history, the truth. You want to complete the truth. You believe there was objective truth in the history. We need a different effort can complete that puzzle. But the relativism seems like to say that all the value got the same, all the perspective got the same value. We all should respect. There's no objective truth or false, or no objective right or wrong. How do you think of that?
So with the relativist approach to injustice that I mentioned, so we often hear, oh, you should be grateful because it's not as bad as it was in this country, or you should be grateful because of this, and all that does is discount the different experiences of different groups, when really it can be bad for someone and still be bad for someone else. Even if it's different, it can still be a negative experience. And so when we think like that, it just is our attempt to kind of negate that person's or group's experience. So I think it's an unhelpful way of thinking to think like that, particularly in this context. In terms of the objective truth that you mentioned, so historians, I'm sure, like to argue with me on this point. I don't think there is objective truth, particularly when we're dealing with histories. Everyone has their different perspectives and stories about an event, and they can be different, but that doesn't mean that they're not true on their own grounds and for that group. And so Māori histories are much better at accepting that. Two different tribes can have a different version of something that happened, but it's still accepted both sides because that is that group's experience. Whereas in the Western historical tradition, there's much more of a focus on wanting to get to some false idea of an objective truth. And I don't know if that answered it, but hopefully it answered it slightly for you. Oh, someone over there.
Thank you for your talk. I was interested in the definition you gave of a myth. And it seems, I guess my question for you is, but we still actually find myths useful, don't we? That you gave the example of a myth where, you know, we Pākehā, if you like, focus on the Great Migration or the big fleet or what have you, and there's far more, and you've painted a very rich picture of that. But even in Māori, from a Māori perspective, myths are important, aren't they?
Yeah, so myths are really important, and it's how you define it and think about it. So myths, in the way that they were traditionally thought of, like mythos and logos, and I won't go too far into that, but Greek thought it was a lot more accepting before we went down the Enlightenment path of how we think about myth, but the way we often think about it now from a Western perspective is associating it with untruth or not factual and not history, whereas if you can read it how they're meant to be understood, they're super valuable and really helpful, but people want to equate them with kind of this binary of truth or non-truth. So I definitely think they're super helpful as long as we're conscious about how we're interpreting them and looking at them. Sorry, I'm not even talking to the microphone now. Oh, and there's someone up there as well.
Thank you. I thought that was really enlightening as well, your talk. My question was, is there any discussion about if the Māori people were ever starving? Because I've heard about maybe the histories of cannibalism, and I find it very difficult when you're a land of plenty, of a lot of fish in the water, so I've always struggled with that thought. With our sea being our fridge and freezer, why would the people be starved or resort to being?
I mean, there's stories of like starvation during certain times, but there was also fern root and things, and I won't go too far into it, but I'm happy to talk to you about it more afterwards. I'll give you some resource in terms of cannibalism, mana and tapu, and kind of the reasons that it was undertaken, because that's just a topic that's been really talked about in a negative way without understanding kind of the background that really went into that, and it wasn't necessarily just a people were starving and that happened situation, but it was part of ritual practices a lot of the time. That's not to say that there wasn't certain, times when people would be hard up in terms of food if there was a bad crop that year and things, but that certainly isn't as simple as kind of that narrative that we've been told about it. But yeah, I'll chat to you after more if you wanted to, and I can give you some more resources on that.
Okay, thank you for your talk. It's the one-way traffic thing that's bothering me. The amount of capital and whatever that would have to be put up to carry out these voyages, it doesn't make sense for it to go one way. And then, and the family connections that were maintained through ancestors and whatnot, you'd think there'd be a desire to maintain, just as you've got at the moment with various diasporas here, with the English and the Samoans and everything else, that's a two-way thing. And it just and on top of that, New Zealand would be ripe for trading in stuff that was here but wasn't in the tropics and vice versa. So was there any evidence of any of that carrying on? And if so, when did it stop, if it did stop?
There's in some traditions, like when it talks about kupe and stuff, it does talk about them going back to the homeland and coming back. So it's definitely not out of the question that there was two-way voyages going on. But also, if you've left for a reason, and then you've got to this land that's just rich in resources, there also wasn't a huge need to be going back and forth as well. And I'm not like a super expert on the voyaging histories in particular. That Jeff Evans book that was on there in Whakamōna would be able to give you more in-depth detail onto kind of the archaeology and stuff of those. But there's definitely not out of the question that there were two-way voyages, but we did see a decline in those long-distance voyaging walkers and a shift to river-going canoes as well during that kind of settlement period. And so there's a whole bunch of different reasons that may have occurred, but it's not out of the question that it was still happening as well. It's 8 o'clock, so we probably have time for one more short one.
We've got a question on Facebook.
Okay.
They say, Kia ora, Maddie. Do you think that the upcoming Aotearoa New Zealand's histories curriculum does enough to address some of the problematic narratives and silences we have in our national colonial history?
I think it's a good step in the right direction. I do some narrative writing for Ngāti Kuia in terms of the history curriculum, so I know that they are engaging with iwi and hapu perspectives, which is really exciting. They're wanting to get our perspectives in there as well. There's obviously going to be some work to be done. I want there to be obviously enough support in place for the teachers, because they wouldn't have had this education themselves, they may not have got it at university, and now they're being expected to teach it to students, and it's very contentious topics which could be quite uncomfortable for them. So I think that's going to be the main area, but it's very, very exciting, and I think in the next kind of decade we'll start to see really awesome payoffs from that. But we certainly need to, especially as a university, be working towards educating the teachers and maybe getting teachers back in that have already done the education to help support them and being able to deliver that curriculum. But it's certainly great from our perspective that they're engaging with iwi in that, because we can also then help them with our experts around developing those narratives that they need. Okay, it's past 8. I don't know how strict we are on this timeline. Do you still have a question? We could finish up on that question maybe.
Thank you. Yes, that was a great talk, Madi. And in the reframing of Aotearoa, with that 1,000-year of history, well, Te Reo has been here for at least, 700 years. English has been here for perhaps 200 years. Te Reo should perhaps be mandatory in school and English voluntary. What's your view about compulsory Te Reo?
Well, the Te Reo expert's sitting at the front, but I'll give it a go. I see the value in making Te Reo more compulsory. I personally am concerned that our whānau don't have opportunities to be learning Te Reo themselves, and so I'm concerned there's soon going to be more people speaking Te Reo without the people that have had it stripped away from them having an opportunity to learn that in a safe place. So my priority in my mind would first be to make sure iwi, hapu and whānau have Te Reo, and then from there move into looking at compulsory in schools. I also think the backlash right now to making it compulsory in schools will result in negative experiences and more discrimination and abuse for our whānau. And it will become a political plaything. So those are just my 2 cents on it. I'm also not a Te Reo expert, but that's where I would be thinking about that at the moment. But thank you for that question. So we have to finish up there, but if anyone is more interested, you are welcome to email me about any of the topics that you're interested in.